Cedar Falls never made the headlines. This quiet town in northern Ohio, with a population of just over 15,000, lived the measured life of the American countryside. Everyone knew their neighbors, church bells called the faithful to worship every Sunday morning, and the main topics of conversation were the weather and the successes of the local school football team, the Eagles. Main Street ran through the entire town, connecting the old historic center with the new residential areas. Along it were small shops, Martha's Cafe, which served the best apple pie in the county, and the Hometown Realty real estate office with large glass windows displaying photos of houses for sale. On one such ordinary Tuesday evening in September 2024, Emily Wright sat at her desk, reviewing documents for a new property, a two-story colonial house on Elm Street. At 32, she was one of the most successful real estate agents in town, which in Cedar Falls meant selling about 20 houses a year. That was enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle and the reputation of a successful family. Emily had always taken pride in her appearance. Neatly styled chestnut hair, strict business suits in pastel colors, always impeccable makeup. Colleagues and clients often noted her professionalism and attention to detail. She remembered her clients' children's birthdays, always congratulated them on holidays, and never forgot to ask about the health of their elderly parents. "Mrs. Wright, you are a real find for our town," grateful buyers of new homes often told her. Their house on Maple Street was the subject of quiet envy among their neighbors. It was a white two-story cottage with blue shutters, a neatly trimmed lawn, and flower beds that Emily carefully planted every spring. The porch was adorned with a wooden swing, where the couple would sometimes sit in the evenings with cups of coffee, discussing the events of the day. Baxter Wright usually returned home at 6:30 in the evening. At 35, he looked like a typical middle-class American, broad shoulders, a strong physique from physical labor, a short haircut, and an open smile. His construction company, Cedar Falls Builders, was small but stable. Baxter specialized in home renovations and small commercial projects, such as updating the facade of a local bank or adding an extension to an elementary school. Baxter Wright was a man of his word, people in town said. If he said he would finish the job on Tuesday, you could be sure that on Tuesday, everything would be ready. He was the senior deacon at First Baptist Church, where the Wright family attended every Sunday. Pastor James Wilson, a friend of the family for many years, often held Baxter up as an example to other parishioners as a model of Christian manhood and business ethics. That Tuesday evening, Baxter entered the house, taking off his work boots at the door as usual. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, and Emily was setting the table with their best china, white porcelain with a blue border, a wedding gift from Emily's grandmother. "How was work?" she asked, as she had asked every evening for the past 10 years of their marriage. "Fine. We finished the frame for the Johnson's addition. Tomorrow we'll start on the roof," replied Baxter, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. He always washed his hands thoroughly before dinner, using a special soap to remove the construction dust that had become ingrained in his skin. Dinner proceeded as usual. Emily talked about potential buyers for the house on Oak Street, and Baxter complained about the suppliers who were again delaying the delivery of bricks. They discussed their plans for the weekend. Emily wanted to go to the county seat to buy new curtains for the living room, and Baxter planned to work in the garage on restoring the old 1978 Ford he had bought a few months ago. But an attentive observer might have noticed subtle signs of tension. Baxter was often distracted during the conversation, his gaze wandering, his answers becoming increasingly monosyllabic. This annoyed Emily, although she tried not to show her displeasure. "Are you even listening to me?" she couldn't help asking when Baxter asked her to repeat what she had just said for the third time. "Of course I am. I'm just tired. It's been a hard day. Every day has been hard for you lately." Baxter looked up from his plate and glanced at his wife. Something flashed in his eyes. Guilt? Irritation? But he quickly looked back down. "I'm sorry. I really have a lot of work right now." The season is ending, and I need to finish all the projects before the cold weather sets in." After dinner, Baxter went to the garage as usual to work on the car, while Amelie cleaned up and prepared for the next day. It was their established ritual, he in the garage, she in the house, each in their own space until it was time to go to bed. But something had changed in the last few months. Amelie couldn't say exactly what, but she felt as if an invisible wall had grown between them. Baxter had become more withdrawn, often staying late at work or going to the garage right after dinner. He used to tell her everything about problems with workers, difficult customers, plans to expand the business. Now his answers had become formal, perfunctory. Their intimacy had also changed. Baxter used to be an enthusiastic and tender lover, but in recent months he had been avoiding intimacy under various pretexts: tiredness, headaches, early mornings. When intimacy did happen, Amelie felt that her husband's thoughts were far away. She tried to bring up their relationship, but Baxter avoided such conversations, citing temporary difficulties and stress at work. Amelie wanted to believe him, but her intuition told her that the problem was deeper. Their friends and acquaintances didn't notice anything. In public, Baxter and Amelie still looked like the perfect couple. At church, they sat next to each other, holding hands during prayer. At social events, Baxter still put his arm around his wife's waist and proudly introduced her to new acquaintances. At the neighbor's barbecue, they joked and laughed as they always had. "You two are just the perfect couple," Martha Jenkins, their neighbor across the street, often told them. 10 years together, and still as in love as the first day. Pastor Wilson also often noted their strong marriage during his sermons, without mentioning names, but everyone in the church knew who he was talking about. When a man and a woman find true understanding and support in marriage, they become an example to the whole community, he would say from the pulpit, and Amelie would feel her cheeks flush with embarrassment and pride at the same time. But at home, when the neighbors' voices died down and the lights in the windows went out, Amelie lay in bed next to her husband, who slept with his back to her, and felt empty. They talked less and less, laughed less and less at shared jokes, and made fewer and fewer plans for the future. Amelie often thought back to the beginning of their relationship. They met in college. She was studying business administration. He was studying construction technology. Baxter was the captain of the university baseball team. She was an activist in the Christian Student Union. A mutual friend introduced them at a party to celebrate the start of the school year. From their first meeting, Amelie was struck by his sincerity and reliability. Baxter wasn't one of those guys who pretended to be cool. He spoke openly about his faith, his desire to build a strong family, and his plans to return to his hometown and develop the family business. For Amelie, who grew up in a single-parent family with a single mother, such stability seemed like a dream. They dated for 3 years, remaining chaste until marriage, as required by their religious beliefs. The wedding was modest but beautiful, held in the same church where they were now active parishioners. The first years of marriage were happy. They built a house, developed their careers, and planned to have children. But the children did not come. After 5 years of trying, they turned to doctors and learned that the problem lay with Amelie. Adhesive disease, the result of a childhood infection, made natural conception extremely unlikely. Doctors offered expensive infertility treatment, but even that did not guarantee results. This was the first serious test of their marriage. Amelie blamed herself and felt inadequate as a woman. Baxter supported her, saying that children were not the most important thing in marriage, that their love was enough. But Amelie saw how he looked at their friends' children, how his face became sad when someone they knew announced their pregnancy. They considered adoption, but ultimately postponed the decision indefinitely. Over time, the subject of children became painful, and they tried to avoid it. Amelie immersed herself in work and church activities, while Baxter focused on growing his business. Now, after 10 years of marriage, Amelie sometimes wondered if their inability to have children was the beginning of their estrangement. Or was the problem something else, something deeper and more hidden? 20 miles from Cedar Falls, on the outskirts of the industrial town of Millfield, was an area that locals preferred not to discuss in polite company. Old warehouses, abandoned factories, and a few bars of dubious reputation made up the landscape of this part of town. It was here, in a converted warehouse with a neon sign reading Rainbow, that Baxter Wright had been frequenting for several months. The Rainbow Club did not advertise its specialty, but everyone in the neighborhood knew it was a place for gay men. The nondescript red brick building with darkened windows and an inconspicuous door served as a refuge for men who could not live openly in the conservative towns of the region. Alex Martinez started working as a bartender at Rainbow 3 years ago after moving from Chicago. At 28, he had seen enough to understand the complexity of gay life in rural America. Coming from a traditional Catholic family himself, he had gone through all the stages of accepting his own sexuality and now helped others cope with similar issues. Alex was an attractive young man of average height with dark hair and expressive brown eyes. His Spanish roots were evident in his dark skin and soft accent, which became more noticeable when he was nervous. Working at Rainbow was not just a way for him to earn a living, but a mission to create a safe space for people who could not be themselves anywhere else. Baxter first showed up at the club in March, on one of those rainy spring evenings. He sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time, gathering his courage before going in. Alex recognized the type right away, a middle-aged married man struggling with his own identity. There were many like him, and each came with their own story of pain and inner conflict. "First time here?" Alex asked when Baxter finally approached the bar and ordered a whiskey. Baxter nodded without looking up. His hands trembled slightly as he took the glass. "Don't worry, it's safe here. No one judges you," Alex said gently. It took several visits before Baxter began to open up. He said he lived in Cedar Falls, worked in construction, and was married. He didn't mention that he was a deacon at church. That information seemed too painful to even say out loud. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he confessed to Alex during one of their evening conversations. "I loved women. I loved my wife. But in recent years, I feel like I'm not living my own life." Alex listened attentively without interrupting. He could see how painful each word was for Baxter. "When did this start?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. Maybe these feelings have always been there, but I suppressed them. In college, there was a guy I was friends with, and sometimes I noticed that I looked at him differently than I did at a regular friend. But then I told myself that it was normal to admire another person's beauty." Baxter fell silent, twirling the glass in his hands. "And then I met Amelie. She was so perfect. Beautiful, kind, religious. I thought those strange thoughts would disappear with her. And for a while, they did." Baxter's story was typical of many visitors to Rainbow, trying to live up to social expectations, suppressing one's true nature, hoping that the right marriage would fix everything. But sooner or later, suppressed feelings demanded an outlet. The turning point came last fall. Baxter was working on renovating the home of a young couple, Tom and Michael, who had recently moved to Cedar Falls from Columbus. They did not hide their relationship, although they behaved discreetly, understanding the specifics of a small town. Observing their interaction, simple gestures of care, understanding glances, natural closeness, Baxter realized for the first time what was missing in his own life. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was an emotional connection he had never experienced with women, including his own wife. After the renovation was complete, Tom invited Baxter out for a beer. The conversation turned to personal lives, and Tom cautiously asked if everything was okay with Baxter at home. "You don't seem very happy," he said. "If you need to talk, I'm here to listen." No judgment, Baxter didn't respond at the time, but Tom's words stuck with him. It was after that conversation that he began searching the internet for information about gay clubs in the area and came across a mention of Rainbow. His relationship with Alex developed gradually. At first, it was just conversations at the bar, Then Alex began to stay after closing so they could talk alone. In these conversations, Baxter found the understanding and acceptance he so desperately lacked at home. "You don't have to make a decision right now," Alex said. "The important thing is to understand yourself, to take an honest look at who you really are." The first kiss happened in May, in Baxter's car in an empty parking lot outside of town. It was a cautious, almost timid touch of the lips, but for Baxter, it was a revelation. For the first time in his life, he felt what he had read about in novels and seen in movies, real passion that takes over your whole being. After that, their meetings became regular. Baxter came to Rainbow 2 or 3 times a week, usually under the pretext of working in the garage or meeting with suppliers. Alex understood the complexity of the situation and did not demand more than Baxter could give. "I don't want to destroy your family," he said, "but you can't live a lie forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to make a choice." At home, Baxter felt like an actor playing a role that was becoming more difficult with each passing day. His intimacy with Amelie had become torture. He performed his marital duties, but his thoughts were far away. He saw how his wife noticed the changes in his behavior, and this intensified his feelings of guilt. Amelie, for her part, tried to understand the reasons for what was happening. Her first thought was about another woman. She began to pay attention to details that she had not noticed before or had not given any importance to. The smell of different soap on her husband's skin after his late nights at work. New habits. He started showering as soon as he got home, which he had previously only done after particularly dirty work. A changed attitude toward his phone. Previously, he could leave it anywhere, but now he always carried it with him and placed it face down. One evening, Amelie decided to stop by his construction site to bring him the lunch he had forgotten. The workers said that Baxter had left 2 hours ago. When asked directly where he had been, Baxter replied that he had gone to the supplier for materials. At 6 in the evening, Amelie was surprised. They have a special schedule. They work late for corporate clients. Lying was becoming increasingly difficult for him, but he saw no alternative. Telling the truth would mean destroying not only his marriage but his entire life in Cedar Falls. His reputation, his business, his position in the church, everything would collapse overnight. Pastor Wilson noticed the changes in Baxter during the last few Sunday services. Usually active and attentive, he had become distracted, often lost in his own thoughts, even during the sermon. "My son," the pastor said to him after the service, "you seem troubled lately. Maybe we should talk?" Baxter declined the offer, citing business problems and fatigue. But Pastor Wilson, who had been conducting spiritual conversations for more than 20 years, sensed that the problem ran deeper. One September evening, Amelie couldn't take it anymore and decided to follow her husband. He said he was going to check on the materials at the new site, but something in his tone seemed suspicious to her. She followed his pickup truck for a few blocks, but lost him in the evening traffic. When Baxter returned home at 10:30, Amelie greeted him with a question. "How are things at the site?" "Normal. Everything is going according to plan. Have the materials been delivered?" Baxter hesitated for a second before answering, "They'll be delivered tomorrow. I just checked the site today." That hesitation was enough to confirm Amelie's suspicions. Something was definitely going on, and she was determined to find out what. Meanwhile, the relationship between Baxter and Alex was deepening. What had started as friendship and support had grown into real feelings. Alex knew he was falling in love with a married man, which was unlikely to lead to a happy ending, but he couldn't stop himself. "I want to be with you for real," he told Baxter during one of their meetings. "No hiding, no lying. Just being together." "I want that too," Baxter replied, "but I don't know how it's possible. If I leave Amelie, the whole town will know about it in a week. And if the truth comes out..." He didn't finish the sentence, but both understood that in Cedar Falls, such a revelation would mean social death. The conservative community did not forgive deviations from accepted norms, especially when it came to family values and religious morality. However, their secret could not remain hidden forever. Too many people had seen Baxter at Rainbow, and the changes in his behavior at home were becoming too obvious. Sooner or later, the two worlds he lived in were bound to collide. October brought the first frosts and golden maple leaves to Cedar Falls. Emily Wright sat in her office, but instead of working on documents, she was flipping through the call history on the phone bill that had arrived the day before. She had never checked such details before, trusting her husband, but now every number seemed like potential evidence. Most of the numbers were familiar: suppliers, customers, his employees. But one number appeared more often than the others, especially in the evening. Emily dialed it, and the answering machine said, "You have reached Millfield Supply. We are open Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It was the number of a building materials supplier, but the calls came at 8 or 9 p.m. when the office was already closed. Perhaps Baxter had the manager's direct line? But then why call so often? Mrs. Wright? Are you all right?" The secretary's voice brought her out of her thoughts. "Yes, of course. I'm just thinking about a contract," Emily lied, quickly closing her account. In the evening, she decided to act more decisively. When Baxter announced that he was going to check on the materials at the new site, Emily said she would go too. She needed to take some documents to a client. "At this hour?" Baxter asked in surprise. "Mr. Hartman works shifts. He asked me to bring the contract by 9 o'clock tonight." The lie came unexpectedly easily to her. They left at the same time, but in different directions. Emily drove a block, turned around, and followed her husband's pickup truck. This time, she managed not to lose sight of him. Baxter really did go to the new site, the Andersons' unfinished house on the outskirts of town. Emily parked in the shade of some trees and watched. Her husband got out of the car, walked around the construction site with a flashlight, and checked something in his documents. Just a normal work routine. But half an hour later, he got back in the car and drove on, toward the highway leading to Millfield. Emily followed him, keeping a safe distance. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure he could hear it even in the car. Millfield greeted them with the lights of industrial enterprises and busier traffic. Baxter turned into an area Emily didn't know. Old warehouse buildings and a few bars. When he parked near a building with a neon sign that read Rainbow, Emily stopped around the corner, not believing her eyes. It was the very bar that was sometimes spoken of with disapproval at church, a place where bad people gathered. Emily had never seen it with her own eyes, but she understood immediately from the descriptions. Her husband, a deacon at the church, a model of Christian morality, had entered a gay bar. Her first thought was denial. Maybe he had a business meeting there? Maybe one of his clients asked to meet him there? But even as she formulated these excuses, Emily realized how ridiculous they were. She sat in her car for 2 hours, watching the entrance. From time to time, someone would go in or come out, mostly middle-aged men who looked quite ordinary. Nothing provocative or caricatured, just people. For some reason, this was more frightening than if they had fit the stereotypes. When Baxter finally came out, he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a young man with dark hair, attractive, smiling. They were talking about something, and Emily saw her husband laugh, the way he hadn't laughed at home in months. They hugged by the car. Not a handshake, not a friendly pat on the shoulder, a real hug. The young man said something, Baxter nodded and got into the pickup truck. Emily managed to note the stranger's license plate number before hastily driving away so as not to be seen. At home, she greeted her husband with the usual question about work, trying to make her voice sound normal. "How are things at the site?" "Everything's fine. The materials have been delivered, and tomorrow we're starting a new phase." Another lie. She could see that he hadn't received any materials. "You look tired. It's been a long day. I'm going to take a shower." Baxter kissed her on the cheek, formally, automatically, and went upstairs. Emily heard the sound of water and tried to make sense of what she had seen. The following days turned into a torture of uncertainty. Amelie painstakingly analyzed her husband's every gesture, every word, trying to find confirmation or refutation of her suspicions. She paid attention to how he looked at other men, how he reacted to news stories or movies with relevant themes. When a story about the legalization of same-sex marriage in a neighboring state was shown on television, Baxter made no comment, although in the past, such topics had elicited a negative reaction from him as a religious man. Amelie decided to seek advice from the only person she trusted completely, Pastor Wilson. On Thursday morning, she came to church under the pretext of discussing the upcoming charity bazaar. Pastor James Wilson was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. He had led the congregation for 15 years and was considered a wise mentor. Amelie had known him since childhood. He had married her in Baxter and would have baptized their children if they had had any. "Amelie, my child, you look troubled," he said when they had finished discussing organizational matters. "What is troubling you?" Amelie hesitated. How could she express her suspicions? How could she talk about something that seemed unthinkable? "Pastor Wilson, what if a person is not who they seem to be? What if the one you love and trust is living a lie?" The pastor looked at her intently. "Are you talking about Baxter?" "I don't know. I think he's hiding something. He's changed. He's become different. I thought it was another woman, but now..." She couldn't finish her sentence. "Amelie, marriage goes through different trials. Sometimes we feel like we don't know the person we live with. But before jumping to conclusions, it's important to talk openly, to try to understand. What if what I find out destroys everything? Our family, our life here?" Pastor Wilson was silent for a long time, thinking about his answer. The truth is sometimes painful, but lies are always destructive. If Baxter is really struggling with some problems, he needs help, not condemnation. And help can only begin with honesty. But what if those problems are unacceptable? Contrary to our faith, our values? Then you both will need a lot of prayer and wisdom, and perhaps professional help. The conversation did not bring Amelie the relief she desired. Instead, the pastor's words strengthened her resolve to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. On Friday evening, she followed her husband again. This time, Baxter was less cautious, perhaps accustomed to not being suspected, or simply tired of the constant tension. He drove straight to the Rainbow without making any preliminary stops at the construction sites. Amelie took up the same observation position. An hour later, the same young man came out of the bar and got into Baxter's car. They drove off together. Following them at a distance, Amelie saw them stop at a small motel on the outskirts of Millfield, a cheap place where no one asked any questions. Baxter checked in at the reception desk and received a room key. They disappeared into one of the buildings. There was no longer any doubt. Her husband wasn't just visiting a gay bar. He was having an affair with a man. All these months, when she blamed herself for the cooling of their marriage, thought about her inability to have children, suspected another woman, the truth was completely different. Amelie sat in her car in the empty motel parking lot and cried. She cried from pain, from humiliation, from rage. 10 years of marriage had been a lie. The man she trusted more than anyone else in the world had been living a double life, making her an unwitting accomplice to his deception. But what hurt her most was the realization that Baxter had never truly loved her. All these years, she had been a cover, a way for him to appear normal in the eyes of those around him. Their marriage, their home, their life together, it was all a sham. When Baxter and his companion left the room 2 hours later, Amelie was no longer crying. The pain had been replaced by cold rage. She watched them say goodbye, another hug, this time longer. The young man said something, and Baxter nodded, smiling. Amelie started the car and drove home, ahead of her husband. She needed time to pull herself together, to come up with a plan of action. When Baxter returned with another story about working overtime, she greeted him calmly, even cheerfully. "How are you? You're late today?" Yeah, I had to stay late. Electrical problems at the site. It's okay. The main thing is that you're home. I made your favorite dish. Baxter looked at her in surprise. It had been a long time since they had had such a peaceful and friendly dinner. Thank you. How was your day? The usual. Work, meetings with clients. By the way, I want to visit my sister in Columbus on Saturday. Haven't seen her in a long time. Of course, get some rest. Baxter was clearly delighted at the opportunity to spend the weekend free, without having to come up with excuses for his absences. This only confirmed Amelie's suspicions. That night, lying next to her husband, who was sleeping peacefully with his back turned to her, Amelie thought about her next steps. Divorce would mean scandal, investigation, and inevitable publicity. In a small town like Cedar Falls, secrets didn't stay secret for long. But what was worse, Baxter might even be happy about the divorce. It would free him to live with that young man, give him the opportunity to be himself. And she would be left with a broken life, the subject of gossip and pity. No, it couldn't be that way. If their marriage was doomed, then Baxter had to pay for a decade of lies. He had no right to just walk away and start a new happy life, leaving her to deal with the wreckage. By morning, a plan had begun to form in Amelie's mind. She knew where her husband held his secret meetings. She knew with whom. All that remained was to choose the right moment for the decisive confrontation. Saturday, October 26th, was cold and rainy. Amelie spent the day in agonizing anticipation, trying to look normal while Baxter did his chores. He was in a good mood, relaxed, even talkative, making plans for Sunday. Apparently, the prospect of a free evening pleased him. After dinner, Baxter announced that he was going to check out some materials at a new site, and then maybe stop by Jim Parker's to discuss a future contract. The usual excuses that Amelie knew by heart. Don't wait up for me. Jim likes to talk over a beer. Of course, dear. I'll read a book and go to bed early. Amelie walked her husband to the door and kissed him on the cheek. Goodbye. It was a typical scene of marital bliss, but now every gesture seemed false and repulsive. When the sound of the pickup truck faded around the corner, Amelie went up to the bedroom and opened the top drawer of the dresser. Under a pile of laundry lay a meat knife, sharp, with a wide blade, which she used for cooking. She had never held it as a weapon before, but now the firmness of the handle in her palm gave her a strange feeling of power and control. Amelie had not planned to kill anyone. The knife was just for self-defense. If Baxter tried to lie to her face, or worse, if that young man turned out to be aggressive. In moments like these, a woman had to be ready to defend herself. She wrapped the knife in a kitchen towel and put it in her purse. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from a sense of justice. 10 years of humiliation and deception had to end today. The drive to Millfield took 25 minutes. Amelie drove slowly, thinking about the confrontation ahead. What would she say to Baxter? How would she explain her presence there? However, the time for explanations was over. It was time for the truth. Baxter's pickup truck was parked in its usual spot next to the Rainbow. Amelie parked in the shade of an abandoned warehouse across the street, from where she had a good view of the club entrance. The neon sign flashed red and blue lights, reflecting in puddles on the wet asphalt. Through the club's windows, she could see the subdued atmosphere inside. Dim lighting, figures behind the bar, music that could be heard even through the car window. It looked like a normal bar if you didn't know its specific nature. People came and went, men of all ages, some alone, some in pairs. Amelie watched this scene with growing disgust. This was where her husband felt at home. This was where he was himself, while at home he played the role of a loving spouse and a respectable Christian. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, the club door opened and Baxter appeared, accompanied by the same young man. Even from a distance, it was clear how comfortably they were interacting, how Baxter laughed at something his companion said. He hadn't been this natural at home in a very long time. They didn't get into the car, but remained near the entrance, continuing their conversation. The young man smoked, gesturing occasionally as he explained something. Baxter listened, nodded, and touched his hand from time to time. The intimacy of these gestures was obvious even to an outside observer. Amelie felt rage boiling up inside her. Not just anger or disappointment, real, primal rage of a woman who had been betrayed in the most despicable way. All these years, when she blamed herself for the problems in their marriage, when she suffered from the inability to have children, when she tried to become a better wife, all this time, Baxter was just playing a role, dreaming of a different life. The conversation at the club entrance lasted about half an hour. Then they headed for their cars. The young man had a silver Honda parked next to Baxter's pickup truck. Judging by their gestures, they were agreeing on where to go next. Amelie got out of the car. The rain intensified, and she pulled the hood of her jacket over her head, hiding her face. The distance between her shelter and the club parking lot was about 50 meters, enough to approach unnoticed in the dark. She moved slowly, hiding behind parked cars. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed the whole neighborhood could hear it. Her hand in her purse clutched the knife handle through the fabric of the towel. Baxter and Alex stood between the cars, partially hidden from prying eyes. Amelie stopped behind the car next to them, 10 meters away, and finally heard their voices. "I can't live like this anymore, Alex. This double life is killing me." "I understand. But we can't rush into anything. We need to think this through." "Think through what?" "I want to be with you. I want us to live together openly." "What about Amelie? Your life in Cedar Falls? Your business?" "To hell with it all. I'm tired of pretending." Her husband's words hit Amelie harder than a physical blow. So he really was planning to leave her. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was going to destroy their life for the sake of this other person. "Listen." Alex's voice was soft and cautious. "I know how you feel. But think about the consequences. If you break with the past abruptly, many people will suffer. And Amelie doesn't deserve such a blow either. Amelie." Baxter paused for a moment. "She's a good woman. But I never really loved her. Not the way I love you." Those words were the last straw. Amelie came out of hiding, and only then did the two men notice her. Baxter turned pale, as if he had seen a ghost. "Amelie, what are you doing here?" She looked at him silently, and that silence was more accusatory than any words could have been. Alex took a step back, instinctively sensing danger. 10 years, Baxter. 10 years you lied to me every day. I can explain." "Explain what? That our marriage is a farce? That you never loved me? You've already explained that?" Baxter looked at Alex, then back at his wife. There was panic in his eyes, but also something else. Relief? Joy that the secret was finally out? "Amelie, please, let's talk about this at home." Calmly. "Calmly?" Amelie's voice rose. "You want me to calmly accept the fact that my husband is gay and plans to leave me for his lover?" Alex tried to intervene. "Ma'am, I think you'd better—" "Shut up!" Amelie shouted. "You destroyed my family. You turned my husband into a liar." "Amelie, it's not his fault," said Baxter. "I did it myself." "You did what yourself? You decided to make a fool of me yourself? You decided you could live a double life while I played the role of the perfect wife at home?" The rain intensified, and all three of them were soaked, but no one moved. The tension reached a critical point. "I didn't want to hurt you." Baxter's voice sounded pitiful. "I tried to be a good husband." "A good husband?" Amelie took a knife out of her purse. The blade glinted in the light of the neon sign. "A good husband doesn't lie for 10 years straight." Alex took another step back, and Baxter raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "Amelie, please put the knife down. We can work this out civilized." "Civilized? How civilized was it when you slept with him while I waited for you at home? How civilized was it when you planned to leave me without even telling me?" I was going to talk to you. When? After you moved in with him? After the whole town found out I was married to a gay man? Baxter took a step toward her, reaching out his hand. Amelie, give me the knife. We'll go home and talk about everything. It was this gesture, his outstretched hand as if he could still control the situation, still manage her, that provoked an explosion of pent-up rage. Amelie lunged forward with the knife in her hand. Baxter tried to back away, but slipped on the wet asphalt. The blade entered his chest just below his heart, and he fell onto his back, clutching the wound. Alex screamed and rushed to the phone, dialing 911. Amelie stood over her husband, who was trying to stop the bleeding, and felt a strange emptiness. The rage evaporated as suddenly as it had come over her. The ambulance and police are on their way, Alex said, kneeling down next to Baxter. Hang in there, everything will be okay. But it was too late. The knife had pierced vital organs, and the blood loss was too severe. By the time the ambulance arrived, Baxter Wright was no longer breathing. Amelie didn't resist when the police handcuffed her. She sat in the patrol car and watched as the medics covered her husband's body with a white sheet. The reality of what had happened had not yet fully sunk in. Detective Mike Thompson arrived at the scene 20 minutes after the first call. At 45, he was an experienced investigator, but murder cases were rare in the county. Most crimes were limited to thefts, bar fights, and random drug deals. Thompson first examined the crime scene, the parking lot in front of a gay club, the victim with a stab wound to the chest, the suspect, the victim's wife, the witness, a young man who claimed to know the victim. The picture was becoming quite clear, but the detective knew that first impressions could be deceiving. "What do we know?" he asked Officer Davis, the first to arrive on the scene. The victim is Baxter Wright, 35, a local building contractor from Cedar Falls. The suspect is his wife, Amelie Wright, 32. The witness is Alex Martinez, 28, who works as a bartender at this establishment. What was Mrs. Wright doing here? Not clear yet. Martinez says she showed up suddenly. An argument started. Then she pulled out a knife. Thompson approached the patrol car where Amelie was sitting. She looked shocked, but not hysterical. Her clothes were wet from the rain, and there were traces of blood on her hands. "Mrs. Wright, I'm Detective Thompson. We need to talk to you about what happened." Amelie looked up at him, her gaze empty and distant. "He lied to me for 10 years. 10 years. I understand. But now we need to figure out the details. Are you ready to give a statement?" "What's the point?" "I killed him." Everyone saw it. Thompson studied her face. Something about this case seemed to him not as simple as it appeared at first glance. Family dramas rarely had only one side to the story. The next few hours were spent going through standard procedures. Amelie was taken to the police station for questioning. The crime scene was cordoned off with tape, and witnesses were interviewed. Alex Martinez was shocked by what had happened, but he answered questions honestly and in detail. He talked about his relationship with Baxter, how Baxter struggled with his own sexual identity and his plans for the future. Thompson listened without judgment, taking notes. "Did he talk about his wife?" the detective asked. "Sometimes. He felt guilty about cheating, but he said he couldn't live a lie anymore." "Did she know about your relationship?" Baxter didn't think so, but from the way she spoke today, it was clear she had found out the truth. When Thompson returned to the station to question Amelie, she had calmed down enough to coherently tell her side of the story. It was a painful and understandable story. A woman who discovered her husband's betrayal, driven to despair, and committed a crime in the heat of the moment. "I didn't plan to kill him," she said. "I took the knife for protection. But when he reached out his hand as if he could still control me, I just couldn't take it anymore." Thompson understood the psychology of the crime, but the law is the law. Regardless of her motives, Amelie Wright had killed her husband and had to be held accountable. By dawn, The basic facts had been established. All that remained was to formally conclude the investigation and refer the case to the prosecutor's office. But for a small town like Cedar Falls, this crime would be an event that would be discussed for years to come. The news of Baxter Wright's murder reached Cedar Falls by Sunday morning. Detective Thompson understood that in a small town, such information spreads faster than official reports, so he decided to personally notify key people before rumors and speculation began. First, he visited Pastor Wilson, whom he found preparing for the morning service at First Baptist Church. The news of the death of one of his most respected parishioners and the arrest of his wife shocked the elderly priest. He sat silently in his office for a long time, digesting the information he had received. Thompson stated the facts without unnecessary details, but Pastor Wilson was wise enough to understand the subtext. The crime scene, the witness named Alex Martinez, Amelie's reaction, it all added up to a painful picture of a broken marriage and hidden secrets. The Sunday service took place in a tense atmosphere. Pastor Wilson announced Baxter's tragic death, asking the congregation to pray for his soul and for Amelie during this difficult time. He did not go into details, but people asked questions and made guesses. By the end of the day, the version of events circulating around town was close to the truth. The investigation progressed quickly. Alex Martinez gave detailed testimony about his relationship with Baxter, providing correspondence and photographs confirming their closeness. Thompson examined the victim's phone records, financial documents, and testimony from neighbors and colleagues. The picture of Baxter's double life began to emerge. Regular trips to Millfield under the guise of business meetings, motel room payments, changes in behavior noticed not only by his wife, but also by his co-workers. One of them, Danny Cruz, admitted that in recent months, Baxter had become often distracted by phone calls. Forensic experts confirmed that the murder was committed with a single stab wound from a knife that Amelie had brought from home. The fingerprints on the murder weapon belonged only to her. No signs of a struggle were found. Baxter did not expect the attack and did not try to defend himself. A psychological examination showed that Amelie was acting under severe emotional stress, but was sane. She understood the nature of her actions and was able to control them. This ruled out the possibility of insanity, but confirmed the version of murder in the heat of passion. A week after her arrest, Amelie was assigned a public defender, Sarah Bennett, an experienced lawyer from the regional center. Bennett specialized in cases of domestic violence and family conflicts and understood the psychology of women driven to despair. The lawyer met with Amelie in the detention center. Her client looked exhausted, having aged several years during her week in custody. She told her story in detail, without holding anything back, from her first suspicions to the final confrontation. Bennett understood that the case would be difficult. On the one hand, the motive for the crime was understandable and even elicited sympathy. A woman who discovered her husband's decade-long deception had every reason to have an emotional breakdown. On the other hand, she brought a knife and used it against an unarmed man. The defense strategy was based on several aspects. First, the prolonged psychological abuse by Baxter, who had been cheating on his wife for years, subjecting her to emotional suffering. Second, the state of affect at the time of the crime, caused by the shocking discovery. Third, the absence of prior intent to kill. District Attorney David Harris, however, saw the case differently. Amelie brought a knife, followed her husband, and planned the confrontation. This indicated premeditation, even if it was not fully formed. Harris insisted on a second-degree murder charge. Preliminary hearings began in November. The courtroom in Cedar Falls was packed. Cases like this happened in the town once a decade. Journalists from regional newspapers covered the trial, turning the Wright family's private tragedy into a public spectacle. Alex Martinez testified as a key witness. He talked about his relationship with Baxter, his struggle with his own identity, and his plans for the future. The young man looked depressed. He blamed himself for what had happened and believed he should have prevented the tragedy. His testimony made a strong impression on those present. Many heard for the first time the details of how gay people live in conservative communities and the pressure they face in trying to meet social expectations. Pastor Wilson was called as a character witness. He described the Wrights as exemplary parishioners, actively involved in church life and respected by the community. The pastor also mentioned a conversation he had with Amelie shortly before the tragedy, when she sought his advice about problems in her marriage. The pastor's testimony helped the defense paint a picture of a woman who was trying to save her marriage, seeking spiritual support, but was driven to despair by her husband's lies. Neighbors and acquaintances described Amelie as a kind, responsive woman who never showed aggression. Many noted that she had seemed depressed in recent months, but they attributed this to infertility issues rather than family conflicts. Psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Morgan conducted a thorough examination of Amelie. Her conclusion confirmed that the defendant did not suffer from mental disorders, but was experiencing chronic stress due to marital problems. The discovery of her husband's infidelity was the catalyst for an emotional outburst. The expert explained to the court the mechanism of effective reactions in people who have been under psychological pressure for a long time. In her opinion, Amelie acted under the influence of acute emotional distress, which significantly reduced her ability to control her behavior. The trial lasted 3 weeks. During this time, the residents of Cedar Falls were divided into 2 camps. Some sympathized with Amelie, considering her a victim of deception and betrayal. Others believed that regardless of the motives, murder could not be justified. The church community was also divided. Some parishioners continued to support Amelie, praying for her and raising money for a lawyer. Others considered what had happened to be punishment for sins and turned away from the family. Pastor Wilson tried to reconcile the opposing sides, calling for Christian mercy and understanding. He regularly visited Amelie in prison, held spiritual conversations with her, and supported her morally. In his sermons, he spoke about the complexity of human nature, about how all people are sinful and in need of forgiveness. The priest avoided direct judgments of Baxter's or Amelie's actions, focusing instead on the need for compassion and understanding. The jury's verdict was a compromise. Amelie was found guilty of manslaughter, a lesser charge than the prosecutor had sought, but one that still carried a serious penalty. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. The sentence did not satisfy everyone, but most agreed that it fairly reflected the complexity of the case. Amelie was punished for murder, but the court took into account mitigating circumstances: her husband's long-term deception, emotional stress, and lack of full premeditation. After the verdict was handed down, Alex Martinez left Millfield. He could no longer stay in places associated with the tragedy, feeling guilty for what had happened. The young man moved to another state, where he started a new life under a different name. The Wright family home was sold to cover legal costs. The new owners demolished it and built a modern building on the site, erasing the last traces of the family tragedy. Baxter's construction company closed after his death. The workers found jobs with other contractors, and the unfinished projects were handed over to competitors. A year later, little remained of the business that Baxter had built over the years. Pastor Wilson continued to serve in the church, but the tragedy had aged him. He often wondered if he could have prevented what happened if he had paid more attention to the warning signs Amelie had given. In his diaries, which were found after his death 10 years later, the pastor wrote about the complexity of pastoral ministry in the modern world, about how difficult it is to help people who cannot be honest even with themselves. Cedar Falls gradually returned to normal life, but the shadow of the Wright family's tragedy continued to affect the community for a long time. People became more cautious in their judgments about their neighbors' family lives, realizing that deep problems could lie behind a facade of well-being. The story of Baxter and Amelie became a warning about what lies in relationships lead to: the inability to be honest with those closest to you. The tragedy showed that social pressure and prejudice can force a person to live a life that is not their own. But sooner or later, the truth will come out, often in a painful and destructive way. Emily served her sentence in a state women's correctional facility. The first years of her imprisonment were difficult. Depression, guilt, attempts to make sense of what had happened. But gradually, she began to accept psychological help and participate in group therapy. After 5 years, Emily was released on parole for good behavior. She left the state and moved to a big city where no one knew her story. Her new life began with volunteer work at a domestic violence shelter. The experience that had once destroyed her life now helped other women cope with family crises. Emily understood their pain like no one else and was able to offer support based on her own bitter experience. The names of Baxter and Emily Wright gradually faded from the memory of the residents of Cedar Falls. New generations knew the story only in general terms, as one of the local legends about how family secrets can be deadly dangerous. But the lessons of that tragedy remained. The church started family counseling programs and support groups for people experiencing relationship crises. Pastor Wilson and his successors understood the importance of creating an atmosphere where people could talk about their problems openly without fear of judgment. The Wright family tragedy served as a reminder that deep conflicts can lurk beneath a facade of well-being, that honesty in relationships is more important than conforming to social expectations, and that the price of deception can be prohibitively high for everyone involved in a family drama.